This past summer, in the summer of 2023, Paris was rocked by a series of protests. The interesting thing was that the French protests were surprisingly similar to the protests that had occurred in the United States only 3 years earlier. In fact, to the outside expert, many couldn't help but notice the parallels to what the French had done in support to the American protests in 2020 and what was actually happening, almost a copycat revival of the French protests in 2023. Good morning. My name is Dr. Sean Williams, and I am joining you today from Campbellsville University, where we are launching our new year of the Campbellsville University Senior Seminar broadcasts, where we're going to be coming to you every week or about every week to talk about contemporary events and current problems in politics in the United States and around the world. I am joined today by my absolutely brilliant panel of guests. As they appear on my screen from left to right, we have Katie Carroll. Good morning, Katie. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm well, thank you.
Fantastic. We also have Mr. Samuel Derrickson. Sam, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for asking.
And last but not least, the highlight of the broadcast. Happy to be awake and alive at 8:30 in the morning. We have Kenzie Forbes. Kenzie, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
So I guess what we want to do is, in order to get started, I imagine that anybody who's watching this, whether they're doing it live or whether they're going to be doing it later, they probably are not as familiar with what happened in Paris in the summer of 2023 as they are with what happened in the United States 3 years ago with our own BLM experience. So if you don't mind, let's start off by familiarizing viewers with kind of what happened. And any of you can just kind of take this question. What happened in France? What were the cause of the summer protests? What was going on?
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting, like you said, how similar it is. So in June, late June of 2023, there was a young man. His name was Nahel, and he was 17 and Muslim and killed at a traffic stop. I believe the police pulled him over for, I think it was not having a license plate on his sports car. I believe that was this scenario. And what should have been a nonviolent interaction ended in Nahel's death. And people obviously did not like that. He was a young man. They didn't think he was doing much of anything wrong. And so people spoke out. So some protests began in summer of 2023 to fight against the actions that happened to this young man.
Now, for people who may not be familiar, driving around without a license plate on your car is actually a fairly common thing in Paris. Paris has very strict environmental protection and anti-pollution laws. And one of the ways they've tried to get around them was by saying that only cars with certain license plate identifiers are allowed in the city on certain days of the week. And so it's fairly common for people to either not have a license plate or to swap license plates as they're driving in. So they might have 2 or 3 different license plates for one car to make sure that they can get access to the city center. And that's something that's fairly common in Paris, something that many people do to try to get around it. Okay, so that actually, I mean, that sounds a lot like what happened with the George Floyd scenario. Where you have somebody who is doing something wrong. It was a relatively minor violation, but it kind of spirals out of hand. Is that? I mean, am I drawing too much into those parallels?
No, that's pretty spot on, and it's also not the first time it's happened in France. Mm-hmm. And George Floyd isn't the only instance that's happened in the United States. Actually, in 2016, there was another case that happened in France. His name was Adama Traore, and he was also killed by police for what should have been a nonviolent interaction.
So again, Paul, viewers are probably a bit more familiar with the American instance, and I invoke the name of George Floyd. It has been about 3 years. And we do deal with college students quite a bit. So if y'all would remind me, the Black Lives Matter protest is kind of the same thing. The death of George Floyd wasn't the first time that an African-American male had died in the United States. what happened around the George Floyd incident, and why was it the one that sparked the protests?
Well, I'll take this one. So George Floyd was accused of using counterfeit money at a bodega, like a corner store in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and some people say that was found out to be false, that it wasn't counterfeit money. Some sources say that it in fact was. Either way, the punishment didn't really fit the crime in that situation. And one of the reasons that George Floyd got so much coverage and so much attention, despite not being the first, the last, or probably even the most violent person to die in America at the hands of the police, or just on a global globally to die that way by the hands of the police. George Floyd's incident was caught on camera. George Floyd's incident, he was recorded being murdered by, my goodness. Derek Chauvin, is the name of the officer that killed him. Derek Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck for several minutes while George pled for his life. Said, I cannot breathe, and nothing was done. He was forcibly held down with a knee on the back of his neck, and he died of asphyxiation. And like Ms. Curl said, in 2016, there was a similar incident in France involving a Black Frenchman named Adama Traore, and some people refer to him as the original George Floyd because he was young, he was 24, but he was murdered via asphyxiation. He died from being suffocated by the police in Paris too. But George Floyd just got a lot of coverage due to the graphic video, the graphic nature of the video that, spread across the entire globe.
Yeah, and after his death, the Black Lives Matter movement, they had already been around, but they really got a resurgence. And so that summer, it was everywhere. There was protests. Some people say there were even riots. There's all sorts of media coverage because of what started with George Floyd, but then extended into other issues of police brutality and protests calling for these officers' arrests and to be charged, which did actually happen. And that's very similar to what we've seen this summer in France. Similar protests for similar reasons.
Even in the United States, I want to follow on this, Carol. You mentioned the question of police brutality. I want to come right back to that. But even in the U.S., many of our younger viewers may not remember Eric Gardner, which I think was in 2014. It was an African-American man who was selling loose cigarettes and was basically choked to death by police on a street in front of a bodega in New York City. You had mentioned the question of police brutality, and that's really kind of what we want to get at is understanding police brutality and why there are these parallels between the United States and France. Ms. Forbes, explain to the viewers what we mean when we're talking about police brutality. I mean, isn't there an expectation that when police are confronting people who are behaving badly, those people might be treated violently because these are violent individuals? Why do we think that police get brutal?
I think that when we're talking about brutality, in any situation, when the police are handling something, there are protocols that they follow, and they have training procedures as to which and bring the offender in these cases of police did they misuse or overuse their power towards these people, and that's what we're seeing.
So, Ms. Forbes, you're a little bit quiet where you're at. We can kind of barely hear you. But you had mentioned the idea of violence towards the individual or excessive force. Are there points at which we can clearly identify that the police is behaving too violently towards somebody who they're detaining, or where they've crossed some kind of a line? Or is it really more not so much a question of what the police are doing, but what the effects are?
I think, sorry if I'm quiet in the library, not supposed to be, but like I said, there are protocols that have to be followed, and in any sense, people, even though people are committing crimes, they still have basic human rights, and someone who is selling bodega should not be asphyxiated, and that it's just like you said, I'm fitting punishment. And I guess that what I'm trying to say is brutality is just when it's it's excessive. Like there's no need to experiment it. Just
That idea of punishment you mentioned there, that's also something that Mr. Derrickson had referred to a second ago, that George Floyd's punishment did not fit the crime. And those are both kind of interesting ways of thinking about it, because at the time of George Floyd's death and at the time of the death of the gentleman in France for the license plate, or with Eric Gardner, they weren't actually being punished for anything, right? Like they hadn't even Breonna Taylor here in the United States, they weren't being punished by police for anything. The police were simply trying to arrest, apprehend, and investigate a crime. Does that fit into the question of police brutality? Whether the police are effectively punishing a person for a violation of the law, or as opposed to simply detaining a person, or is it more about, as you referred to, Ms. Forbes, this idea of human rights violations, that the brutality is more about violating rights?
punishment is not put into the hands of fair enforcement and obeying the laws, bring them in. Once you get there, from a system and responsibility for punishment and corrections, and with brutality, I think we're more discussing even though these black people, they still have human rights that need to be respected.
Yeah, it almost seems like in cases of police brutality, the police is trying to punish. Even though that's not what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be protecting and serving and detaining who needs to be detained and keeping the community safer. But it seems like in these cases of police brutality, for some reason, which we'll probably get to, these police officers feel like they need to punish the person that they're going after, or they need to be extra forceful because they could be dangerous, but then they're not. And then you have instances of police brutality where people get harmed in a wrong way.
Now, often whenever we're having conversations about this, or whenever I speak to one of my colleagues who teaches or works in a criminal justice program, or one of my fellow political science professors, we tend to think about the causes of police brutality into two different camps. So on the one hand, people talk about how some cultures are just more violent and therefore they produce more violent police officers. On the other hand, some talk about how there is a separate culture within police departments having nothing to do with broader culture, and that it's the police departments are at fault. So let's look at these kind of one at a time. First of all, is there something about French culture that is similar to American culture that leads our police forces to be more violent? Or is it maybe more likely the case that really our cultures are no different than others? It's just that we have some greater level of transparency. So police violence becomes more visible in the way that maybe Mr. Derrickson was referring to with George Floyd. Which do you think that is? Is there an American violence problem or a French violence problem, or is it just transparency?
I would say that it is an American and a French violence issue. Um, I think that when you have nations that are built on white supremacy, whether it's in drastically different ways across both nations. America has a very storied history of discrimination, racism, a past, riddled with problems stemming from slavery, and all the things that follow thereafter. France is a little different due to the fact that France tries to operate on a racial blindness. They try to operate as a racially blind society. They don't even collect statistics on race. They collect statistics on country of origin, meaning that if you were born elsewhere and you immigrate there, you are marked down as an immigrant and they know what region of the world you came from. But anyways, to get back into the question at hand, it is a violence issue because when you have countries that perpetuate white supremacy and there are systems at play that have been kind of created and designed to uplift white people in France, or white people in America, European, if you wanted to use, that way to define them, that term to define them, versus immigrants, or in the case of America, people who, were formerly enslaved or immigrants to a certain extent. It seems that the systems are rigged against them, that the systems are designed, the way that policing is done in both places are designed and set up in a way that targets people who fall into some type of minority group, whether it be Black African Americans, Black Americans, whether it be North African Muslims in France, or whether it be Sub-Saharan Africans in France as well. These systems they're more likely to be stopped by the police, and these violent systems are targeted towards them.
Ms. Carroll, do you have a similar opinion? Do you think that it's also a cultural difference?
I would have to agree with Sam that it is a cultural difference because you see countries in Western Europe that are neighbors to France that do not have the same problem, that have police forces that do not regularly kill their citizens. One of the reasons why possibly that we could look at that France and the United States are both similar on is their issues with race, as Sam was talking about. And to do that, we can look at the history. We can look and see that the United States has notoriously had a problem with race, slavery for many years until the 1800s. And then even after that, we had segregation and up until the Civil Rights Movement. And then even today, we still see issues with institutionalized racism. And then in France, their main problem is xenophobia. And they go for immigrants, as Sam also mentioned, and they don't treat those people the same as they treat French citizens. But it also does have to do with race in France, because there are sources that talk about how white immigrants have an easier time assimilating than Arab immigrants or African immigrants. So yeah, it is a violence problem. It is a cultural issue with France and the United States, and it starts from the conception of their countries.
Ms. Forbes, what do you think? Do you think there's an America and France problem?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
No worries.
It was like cut out.
Yeah. Do you think that there is a cultural problem with America and France, or do you think that this has a lot more to do with just the culture of the police departments themselves?
I think that it is a cultural problem. Like they both said, I agree with both of them. But just looking at the history in both the France and the U.S., and just like constant and kind of embedded in culture, even though now it's kind of I wouldn't really say taboo, but not something that a lot of people, this still exists, and it's not as bad, but up there with how it was in the past in history.
So help me understand a little bit then. Assuming that there is, as you guys suggest, cultural issues that are, you know, woven into the fabric of American and French culture, as you suggest. How does that translate into police behavior? The police are supposed to be the professionals who've been trained on how to do this. How do they become the violent arm of, as Mr. Derrickson referred to, a racist society?
Well, during my research, I come to find that in both cultures, in both countries, there is this linkage between your status as an immigrant or your status as a minority here in America as African American, largely African American, but Hispanic folks as well. There is this linkage between your culture and an affinity to crime. And it's commonly held misconceptions and stereotypes in common society that perpetuate these things. You know, people think that African Americans, for example, have an affinity to, criminality and to violence because they believe that it's a cultural thing. Racism has moved from it being biological differences to cultural differences, that our music and our culture perpetuates violence and crime and criminality. You see the same thing in France, where they believe that Muslim immigrants have a proclivity to violence. They are more inclined to be violent due to their culture, due to their identity as Muslims. They're viewed as Muslim first and French citizens or French immigrants second. And the reason that matters is because if society feels this way, the people that police these communities are from the society in which they police, and they are in kind of a strange place because not only do a lot of them hold these same emotions and feelings towards minority groups, they are in a position of extreme authority on the streets that they patrol. They're in a position to either really help people or really hurt people. You're giving them a lot of power. You're arming them, literally arming them to go into these communities and police. And when they do this, they're operating under certain pretenses, certain biases, and it comes out. It manifests in murder. It manifests in brutality. It manifests in excessive force, and it's without a doubt a symptom of the society, of the racism that is so embedded in both societies.
If I can add, I do agree. I just wanted to add to the point where you asked about the police. It is the sad kind of reality of the fact that these are people that you're putting the trust into police the community. And just like in every profession, there's always going to be a handful that are bad. And you get these people who have these ideologies and fall into the, stereotypes of the racial or cultural beliefs, and then you give them a badge and you give them a gun and you tell them with these people when they tell this work. And then it's also some people join the force because of the badge and the gun, and because they feel like they'll be more powerful than other people, but they're power hungry, and I guess you could say so. They abuse and they use that to their advantage.
Do you think that's an interesting argument? So this notion that something about being a police officer, or you might even call it the citizen soldier mentality, attracts people to the police force. Are there ways that police departments can either effectively filter out those bad apples, or are there ways that once somebody gets into the system that they can be better trained or effectively assigned so that we don't have the problem of police brutality? Or is this just something that if you have a racist society, you get racist police officers who are therefore going to target minorities?
I don't think it's that simple. I think that there are solutions, and it can be fixed. Maybe not totally, but there are some solutions. I think once a police officer is a police officer, there can be more done in ways of training, diversity training, really getting to know these different groups of people and learn common stereotypes and prejudices that people might not even know that they have, and then learn how to combat those and how to not let those stereotypes, prejudices influence you in the field so that you make a mistake that could ruin your life or end somebody else's.
I think that there also is room for upgraded accountability measures in policing. We see a lot of the times in policing these officers that go on to kill people. In the case of Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, Derek Chauvin had several complaints made against him, cases filed against him for excessive force and discrimination. And the city of Minneapolis allowed Derek Chauvin to stay on the streets of Minneapolis when he probably shouldn't have been. And this allowed him to, escalate to the point where he took a life. He took a black man's life for arguably no other reason that he was black. So I think that like Katie said, that there needs to be training, but there also needs to be accountability, real accountability for when you do bad things on the street. We get you off the street as a police officer. And to the training aspect, there has to become some type of anti-racist training, because we're programmed all throughout, our childhood education and our adolescence that things are this way. We may hear it, and we need to address the people that we're going to give firearms to and put on the streets to protect us. We need to make sure that they do not fall into these stereotypes, that they don't perpetuate the way that we stigmatize these communities, or things like this will always happen.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I don't want to suggest that it's not possible to alter police culture. I think certainly if it wasn't possible, then we would see a more equal distribution of police violence across France and across the United States. Whereas apparently we tend to see pockets of it in different locations. That being said, when we talk about police accountability, I mean, I often hear people say, well, we need to prosecute the police officer. That if a police officer engages in a violent activity or does something wrong, that they need to be subject to criminal prosecution in the way that we prosecuted Derek Chauvin for his actions. But at the same time, if every time a police officer engaged in an activity, he had to be afraid that he was going to be prosecuted criminally for violations of law, would we get any good police officers to sign up? I mean, why would you take a position if you know that you're going to be engaging in activities that are likely to get you prosecuted for breaking the law?
Well, in America, we already have qualified immunity. We already have, which is more of a civil thing, but it can matter in cases of criminal, misconduct. But anyways, we already have protections for our police officers. We already have mechanisms to protect them, so that if they are operating within the requirements of their duty, if they're operating within the limits of what we are paying them as a society to do, that they are protected in doing so. It's when you get outside of what your duty calls for, what your role calls for, that you should be held accountable. We're not there. There are police officers, I'm sure, that go above and beyond to maintain a certain level of, connection with the communities they serve, and they do go above and beyond to be sensitive, racially sensitive to issues. But there has to be a call to those that aren't. There has to be something done to weave out and to get rid of those that are not. I'm not saying that we should be prosecuting every single officer anytime he gets into a situation where violence is necessary, because there are situations where violence is necessary. I'm specifically speaking to when they go above and beyond and outside of the call of duty.
And I would argue that if these officers have the correct training, they'll know what's right and they'll know what's wrong. And they shouldn't be worried for the most part about getting in trouble. And maybe they should be a little worried. Maybe they should be thinking, oh, is what I'm doing necessary for what this criminal is doing? Am I supposed to be using this much force? And you can tell when a police officer is supposed to be using the amount of force that they need to be using. If somebody's trying to run away, if somebody is violent, if they have a weapon. So if these officers are trained correctly, I would argue that they shouldn't worry, but some level of worry might help the issue.
And bouncing off of what she said, I was kind of going to say a similar thing. With the training, if police are trained correctly, and if they go into situations doing what they're trained, but like a little element of worry, what they're doing in a situation, the same way as if we're driving down the road and we're going 50 speed limit, nervous. If they're using excessive force in a situation, should I?
So I guess we're almost out of time. I'm looking at the clock. We started out on this high note talking about police brutality. Now I feel like I'm getting more and more depressed. So here's what I want to do to end the broadcast. I want to go around the room and let's optimistic or pessimistic. Do you feel like France and the United States have the ability to effectively reform enough so that we can reduce incidences of police brutality? Or do you feel, after having done research for the last couple of weeks, do you feel like the cultural and institutional patterns are kind of locked in? So optimistic or pessimistic, and explain why. Ms. Forbes, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. I'm optimistic that reform can be done for these situations. Even though I do think that it is cultural. Like in any other, like when you say you break a generational thing, there can be things that can be done to combat it. Are you ever going to be able to cut out every single police officer who is racially motivated in the way that they handle situations? No, that's the reality of it. But with better training and de-escalation situations and more repercussions for when these things do happen, instead of having to have to get something done, just having these repercussions, I feel like it can greatly lower the situation.
Mr. Derrickson, what do you think?
I have real hesitation in saying that reform can happen as police departments, both in America and France, are concerned, as they're currently constructed. As police departments are currently constructed in the way that we do policing in both countries, and the leash that we give officers to pretty much impose street justice, to be judge, jury, and executioner, with very little checks and balances on the street itself. As it's currently constructed, I do not think that policing is in position for reform. You would almost have to, I wouldn't like to use the word abolish, but you would have to greatly restructure the way that we do policing for it to be equitable, for it to be, policing to be uniform across every, minority group, every majority group, for everyone to receive the same product, we would have to do a lot of reform, both here in America and in France. In France's case, they're going to have to recognize that race exists for people to get proper policing regardless of race. The fact that you deny race, like you live in a raceless society, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing people of color, be targeted. You have to acknowledge that there's an issue to fix the issue. So as of right now, I'm very, very much so pessimistic.
Ms. Carroll, you get the final word.
So I think that, short answer, the United States and France could, in coming years, resolve the issue with police brutality. Long answer, it's going to start with the people. It's going to start with protests. We can already see people speaking out against what they view as injustices and wrongs that are being done to them by an office that's supposed to protect them. I think that it could be fixed because it's happened before. Look at the United States, the civil rights movement. People had a problem with how Black people were being treated in the United States, so they did something about it. It took a long time, and it took several years to accomplish, and to even then after have people's thoughts change and implicit racism go away, which we still see today sometimes. But I think it's possible. It's happened before. It's going to start with the people, and it's already started. So maybe, like Sam said, it would have to be a total restructure of the police departments. But for that to happen, I think it still has to start with the citizens who have a problem with it and who say, hey, enough is enough. It's time to change things.
I appreciate that at least a couple of you are optimistic. However, as Ms. Carroll pointed out, that doesn't sound like it's going to be an easy task, even if it is a possible one. Well, it looks like we're about out of time. I again want to appreciate everyone and thank you all who joined us or who watched this on delay. I also wanted to thank my panel, by the way, for joining us for this conversation. And I wanted to remind everyone who is watching at home that this is the first of our season of broadcasts. And so if you're interested, you're more than welcome to join us again on September 26th, 1 week from today at 8:30 in the morning, where a panel of experts will be talking about NATO expansion into Asia and considering whether or not we should expand our reach and try to combat Chinese aggression as well as current Russian expansion. But in the meantime, thank you everybody for joining us, and God bless.